Thanks, everyone, for joining us back at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Anthony O'Rourke and Wadie Saeed. Anthony is the Joseph W. Belloc and Laura L. Aswad Professor of Civil Justice at the University at Buffalo School of Law, State University of New York. And Wadie Saeed is a Professor of Law and Dean's Faculty Fellow at the University of Colorado Law School and the author of Crimes of Terror. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So, as the saying goes in organizing circles, COINTELPRO never ended. And your most recent co-authored article in Dissent, titled Terrorism Investigations on Campus and the New McCarthyism, outlines a so-called material support statute, which, quoting from the article, criminalizes public advocacy that is done under the direction of or in coordination with foreign terrorist groups. It's a nebulous federal statute that imposes prison sentences of up to 20 years, end quote. So I was wondering, if, starting off here, could you give us some backstory on this statute, what it's been used for in the past, and also how organizations typically end up on the FTO, the Foreign Terrorist Organization list?
Well, if I could, yeah, I'll start with this. I'll start with answering that because, this is a statute that actually was passed in 1996 in some very strange circumstances. There were some attacks in the Middle East that that President Clinton at the time was very concerned that were disrupting the Middle East peace process, which led to an executive order in 1995. And then there was some lobbying on behalf of what became the Material Support Statute that ultimately didn't get passed until the Oklahoma City bombing kind of propelled Congress to do so, which was, of course, a domestic act. So it was kind of very kind of strange circumstances. But the upshot was that this law was passed as part of a larger kind of omnibus act, criminalizing a whole bunch of areas of law and also curtailing prisoners' ability to use habeas corpus in a kind of a more effective way, basically gutting those avenues for relief for prisoners, state and federal. So it came about in those circumstances and was passed in 1996. And basically one of the key elements of the law was that it allowed and still allows the Secretary of State to essentially what's called designate, which is akin to banning any group that is, one, foreign, two, engages in terrorist activity, and three, that terrorist activity threatens U.S. national security, the security of United States citizens, or some sort of American or United States foreign interest or economic relations. And that last category is pretty nebulous. And these are not things that can be challenged in court, except for the fact that, say, if if the Secretary of State were to designate a group, the wrong group, let's say, just got the name wrong or got the wrong, something basically administrative is the only way to challenge this. It's not something that can be subject to any sort of kind of case, or legal challenge.
So there's essentially no defense in court. Is that correct?
Yeah, the statute actually says that. It says that if someone is charged with conspiring to provide material support or providing material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization, they cannot raise the criminal defendant who's charged with this violation or with this offense can't raise the designation of the group as part of their defense.
Oh, the land of the free. Well, so I want to also get into what material support, quote unquote, means, because when I hear it, I'm thinking like pallets of cash. But kind of like the thesis of this piece that y'all wrote is that material support is now creeping into the area of speech. And not only that, but to very dangerously conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Could you talk about how that sort of creep in terms of this statute?
Yeah, sorry, Tony, do you mind if I go ahead just with this? Yeah. So basically what the initial kind of thrust behind the law was that there was a claim that Congress accepted, and it made a finding that terrorist organizations are raising money under the cover of humanitarian activity for terrorists, for their other activities, for their violent activities. The theory is, and Congress adopted this, is that money is fungible. So money for humanitarian needs, which the government didn't challenge were legitimate, frees up money for bombs and weapons. But as you see, right, the whole focus of material support was money, weapons, tangible things. But the statute was, written in such a way as to be malleable, as many of these things that Congress does end up kind of taking that shape. And what ended up occurring was, there was defendants and even kind of individual litigants noticed that there was the potential for material support to take the form of speech. So there were a couple of organizations, American organizations led by American citizens, that wanted to provide kind of peaceful help to groups that were designated. And that case reached the Supreme Court in 2010. It was a case called Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. And the Supreme Court said that, yes, in fact, material support in the form of speech, like, so if you wanted to provide expert advice to a foreign terrorist organization to be more peaceful and not use violence, that could still be criminalized as material support and not offend the Constitution. And so when that happened, that was kind of a watershed moment for the breadth of this law. And the kind of the critical safeguard was that the speech could not be independent advocacy, right? That someone can still support a terrorist organization, designated foreign terrorist organization, with speech, as long as they're not acting on behalf of or in coordination with the foreign terrorist organization. But when you put that all into the mix of the background of post 9/11 kind of Islamophobia, a hypercharged war on terror, so to speak, those distinctions are subject to interpretation, as we've seen in recent weeks with the concept of speech being so contested. So it's still a very, very dangerous development in my view.
Yeah, and I, as noted in the article, when the FTO list first came out in October 1997, 7 of the 28 groups designated were Palestinian, which really is, it says way more about the U.S. Stance on Palestinians more than it says about Palestinians, I feel. And as you note, Al-Qaeda was not designated until 1999.
Well, and one more quick thing about this is that the kind of prototypical terrorist group was in fact Hamas, right? That some of the groups lobbying behind the scenes for the passage of this law were targeting the terrorist organization as envisioned by the Hamas movement, right? This idea that there's a political wing, a military wing, and a social or charitable wing was kind of how it was drawn up. So this model doesn't really fit a lot of groups, but it did fit Hamas. So that's also something that comes into effect with some of the later prosecutions under this law.
Yes, absolutely. And lest we forget, Osama bin Laden was actually on the payroll of the U.S. government. So it's not like the U.S. has a distinct and constant perspective on what constitutes a terrorist. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about that specific anti-Palestinian stance, because you also mentioned in the article the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, and I was wondering if you could just outline a little bit about how they are pushing this point very hard in a lot of different ways, whether that be particularly with college campuses or particularly with the U.S. government.
Sure. Well, let's speak to what the ADL did that was the occasion for this article, just to start. So a few weeks after October 7th, the Anti-Defamation League and the Brandeis Center, which is not affiliated with Brandeis University, issued an open letter to university presidents calling on them to investigate their chapters of Students for Justice in Palestine for material support of terrorism under the material support statute, for, quote, endorsing the actions of Hamas and voicing an increasingly radical call for confronting and dismantling Zionism on US college campuses. And this is easy to sort of treat as just another of the sort of the latest of a series of volleys in these free speech wars about what's going on campus. There has been incredible repression and suppression of pro-Palestinian speech going on, all of which is reprehensible and deserves to be mobilized against. But in a way, this is distinctive because the Anti-Defamation League isn't just another organization. It is a civil society organization that has close connections to law enforcement, that trains federal law enforcement, that has been alleged to obtain intelligence information from organizations associated with Israel on what is going on campus, and has had lobbied for the implementation of the material support statute. So it really has an agenda-setting power and a degree of connection to federal law enforcement that makes it distinctive and creates a real threat that it's going to enable or facilitate the expansion of material support investigations to specifically target pro-Palestinian student speech.
So I'm curious about the ire that's directed specifically towards college campuses. Why is that? And how do you feel about people who say, well, I'm not a student, so I don't need to worry about this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So college campuses, I think, are fertile ground for understanding and challenging the larger Zionist project in the United States. And students have been at the forefront of pro-Palestinian activism. Students for Justice in Palestine is not just one of the leading voices on campus against Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people, but it's one of the leading voices in the United States. So campuses have long been the target of scrutiny and attack by people who are trying to suppress pro-Palestinian student advocacy. And one of the techniques for doing so is to conflate anti-Zionism or critiques of Zionism with anti-Semitism. And increasingly, they have mobilized the United States government in the project, for example, but with congressional hearings calling university presidents to the floor for allegedly failing to protect their students from anti-Semitic attacks, where the definition of anti-Semitism is conflated with that of anti-Zionism. And so I think why this is of concern to people who aren't students is that it represents a dramatic expansion of the state apparatus against speech. One of the most significant guardrails that came out of COINTELPRO, that came out of the abuses of FBI investigative power in the 1960s, is to implement measures that treat investigations on college campuses as sensitive investigative matters that at least require some degree of oversight before the FBI steps in and starts mucking around on campuses. But it seems like increasingly there's pressure being placed on law enforcement to drop those guardrails. And I think that's a source of concern for anyone.
Yeah, I would just add, because I think Tony spells out a very important point about this idea that, the history of the FBI on campus is not a happy one, since the creation of the agency, but certainly in that crucible starting from, the civil rights movement and anti-Viet War movement of the 60s and onward towards, the creation of the COINTEL program, and the fact that it survives, even if not in name or in actual form, but it survives like kind of substantively in to the present day. It kind of it kind of picked up on the post-September 11th war on terror with a focus on terrorism, where a lot of the tactics were kind of recycled and repurposed. And I think the critical thing also to add about the issue campus speech is what has, I think, alarmed the pro-Israel lobby, the ADL being kind of chief among them, but the Brandeis Center also played a particularly strong role here with its director when he was the head of kind of enforcement of anti-discrimination on campus during the Trump administration and the Department of Education. What you've seen is the United States, which kind of has the First Amendment as its hallmark freedom, and one of its kind of great draws for people from all over the world is its, university climate and university culture, which kind of promotes itself as this place where speech is open and free and ideas can be discussed. And if that's true, and I think, to varying degrees it was, the Palestinian narrative is clearly winning because, I mean, in my view, it has truth on its side. It has it right on its side. And the younger generation being exposed to this narrative more and more, we're rallying around it. So the response has been to kind of just outlaw or proscribe that type of speech, right? And that's what we're seeing here. I mean, the congressional hearings of, I think it was last week, where Representative Stefanik says Intifada is a call for genocide of Jews. What? Intifada, the first Intifada is a kind of, from 1987 to 1993, is kind of the hallmark achievement of the Palestinian people, at least in terms of more recently, in terms of how they struggled in a mostly nonviolent way against the longest military occupation of modern times. So, it's the answer to speech hasn't been more speech. It's been, okay, we can't have that kind of speech. We're just going to call it anti-Semitic. We're going to call it genocidal, even as, we're seeing a genocidal campaign take place in real time. So I've been commenting to friends and family, because I was recently traveling abroad, that coming back to the United States has been entering an alternate reality, where I don't understand kind of how the discourse has taken shape the way it has, but it has.
Yeah, absolutely. Stepping outside for the empire for a moment gives quite a disturbing lens on things. And I want to pick up on that. Well, you talked about this, the PR campaign that the US, or in particular US universities, are places where you can think out loud and you can have these discussions and debates without fear of, being locked up for it. And I'm curious, beyond just kind of a philosophical conversation, what do you think the likelihood of this moving to the point where it basically denies people the access to the First Amendment in terms of the right to speech or assembly?
In my view, it already has. I mean, universities have canceled their chapters of Students for Justice in Palestine. Of course, as a law professor, I have to be a little bit persnickety and mention that private college campuses do not have to honor First Amendment rights, but traditionally they have. And public universities certainly do. And this cancellation of chapters of Students of Justice in Palestine is not just going on private campuses, but also at Rutgers University. The State University System of Florida, citing the material support statute after the ADL letter, has tried to shut down its chapters and is currently in litigation with the ACLU. So right now we are seeing, I think, a climate of speech suppression that I would have thought unimaginable even in September of this year. And a concern of this essay is that it will not only be the suppression of speech, the expulsion of students, the suspension of students, all of which are awful, and all of which are a transformation of the culture, I think, as Wadie put so well, but that it can also increase and strengthen the criminal investigative apparatus against students, and we might start seeing a real mobilization of federal and state law enforcement against students in ways that we haven't seen before.
And I wanted to add to what Tony was saying, about how the First Amendment violations are actually happening now, and they've already, the line has been crossed. The thing that's, I think, also been hard to process is how this is related to a conflict in which the United States is not an actor. I mean, it's very, very strongly involved and supporting, but at least officially, it's not participating in any open hostilities. Congress hasn't declared war, even though there's an air bridge or an airlift of support of hundreds of planes of aid, military aid, and otherwise going to the Israelis. But it still is, despite all that, it still is a foreign conflict, and the idea that I think whenever you look at the concept of free speech, you're always, I think, you always have to pay attention to how close to home it hits, right? The closer to home it hits, the less likely the government is to be able to, understand what's protected speech and what isn't, right? It's, kind of a version of Homerism or something like that. And here we're seeing it in this kind of context where the threats to the average American are not necessarily clear. So then the issue of anti-Semitism comes in, where they're being conflated. And the thing I think that's also alarming to see, this is a little bit more from the outside, is the complete marginalization or willingness to deploy anti-Semitism against anti-Zionist Jews, who have been very much prominent in pro-Palestinian advocacy over at least the last decade, if not longer. So at least in the sort of the wider context. I mean, there have been Jewish pro-Palestinian activists as long as the Palestinian issue has existed, but certainly the prominence of some of those organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace has really come to the fore. And it's really kind of strange is really an understatement to see this dynamic taking place.
Absolutely. Strange and angering and depressing. I can't count the number of times in the past 2 months that I've been called not a real Jew. And I'm curious with regards to this, is there any connection? I know that, with regards to pro-Israel and not being allowed to engage in the BDS movement and things like that, some 30 states have loyalty to Israel clauses. And so do you see this specifically in those states, or is this kind of a national push? And do you see more states then glomming on to that you can't speak bad of Israel, you have to be loyal to Israel idea?
I think that this is a national phenomenon. You are seeing the suppression of pro-Palestinian speech on campuses in states that would never have passed or had not previously passed a BDS law that would have been skeptical of those types of restrictions on speech. Just 2 weeks ago, after the congressional testimony of the university presidents that generated such backlash, the governor of New York issued a public letter saying that calls for genocide on SUNY campuses, on one of which I teach, are going to be treated with expulsion, suspension, and the most severe possible penalties. And that is, of course, in the context of the congressional testimony where university leaders basically accepted the premise of Elise Stefanik that calls for "Long Live the Antifada" or the chant "From the River to the Sea" are effectively calls for genocide. So even in sort of blue states, democratic states, states that had normally railed against the restrictions on freedom of speech in other states, you are starting to see policies being implemented that are targeting speech in students.
Yeah, and so kind of wrapping up here, there doesn't seem to, because as you noted, there's really no defense once you get to the point of being in court. And so what kind of safeguards, if any, are there against this that already exist, or what, in your experience of criminal law, would be safeguards either for college campuses or for specific localities or even federally against this push?
Well, so I would say to that, it's unclear to me how much the use or the deployment of the material support law is designed to actually prosecute students for providing material support to a foreign terrorist organization. Because those links, even though, as we mentioned in the article, even though those kind of, that area of the law is unelaborated, still, I think the bigger danger, at least now, because this idea of coordinating with a terrorist organization or working in its direction is going to be, I think it's going to be tricky to prove. I think the bigger deal is the idea that the FBI or other government agents might go in, conduct an investigation, and then find something, right? And then find other ways, sort of a pretextual type of investigation. I mean, in the recent history of pro-Palestinian advocacy, what we saw in the last, this is in the last 5-10 years, there was an investigation of pro-Palestinian groups in the general Chicago area, which led to, I think it was the general Chicago area, which didn't produce any indictments for, material support of terrorism or otherwise engage in, otherwise target terrorist activity, but they did target a community activist called Rasmia Wadie, who was a well-known activist in the Chicago area. And she was targeted because when she came to this country, she had mentioned that she had never been arrested, and she had been arrested and spent 10 years in Israeli prisons for being implicated and convicted of an attack on a market in West Jerusalem that left 2 Israelis dead as part of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a designated foreign terrorist organization in this group. And, she wouldn't have been targeted. She had been here 20 years, wasn't active politically with any group. It was clearly seen as a message to the community that the government will come after the Arab American community leaders, even on the most thin of pretexts. And even when she was able to successfully argue that her confession to the Israelis was the product of torture, the government just kind of switched they're allowed to do this. It's called superseding the indictment, where they basically change the terms of the indictment sort of midstream and charge her with a new offense that was basically impossible to defend against. So she ended up being deported and stripped of her U.S. nationality. So that's, I think, a really key fear, is that this could be a pretext to something bigger, especially when you have students of Palestinian origin or foreign origin who can be susceptible to things like being deported and being stripped of their nationality.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I think in terms of what can be done, right? What can be done to resist this or try to mobilize against this pressure? The short answer is, I think it's going to have to come from the bottom up, and there has to be grassroots mobilization against these kind of disciplinary measures and against this kind of speech suppression. In our article, we list 3 specific things that universities could do to try to protect against pretextual investigations. I mean, very briefly, they should never allow speech to be the basis for a material support investigation, and they should draw a public line at protecting students from criminal investigations based on their political speech. Second, they should not cooperate with federal or state investigations under the material support statute without a court order. And third, universities that cooperate with federal law enforcement on terrorism matters, and there are many, should rethink those agreements and renegotiate their understandings with state and federal law enforcement to exclude cooperation on material support investigations. But the truth of the matter is that the recent congressional testimony and the backlash has shown that university presidents are so far away from this sort of thinking and this habit of trying to figure out how best to support speech and protect their students, that they're not going to do this or implement these measures on the basis of reading an essay in Dissent. There's going to have to be widespread political mobilization against it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I know I said finally, but while you were speaking, I just thought of one last thing. And that's because from the river to the sea, I thought somebody was joking when they told me that people were conflating that with a call for genocide, because I was like, that's geography. And if Zionists think that that's genocidal, that's their own genocidal thinking getting in the way of common sense. But if we are at that point where from the river to the sea can equal death to all Jews, like, where are we in terms of the difference between hate speech and free speech? And then where do you draw that line in terms of criminal law?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think drawing the line, I think this whole discussion, I mean, I think Tony pointed out the last part of the article where we tried, we're both law professors, and I think we both, didn't want to do the classic law professor thing of, proposing here's a 3-part test to solve this issue. And I think we ended up coming out with this idea that, like, there should be no cooperation. It's a kind of like, don't do this. It's a 3-part test that hides the fact that it's kind of more of an abolitionist or like a, this is wrong, full stop position. So I think, it's really important to go back to what he just highlighted in terms of, all these practices are wrong. And I think further, the level of bad faith that's behind this is staggering, simply because there's a long history now, especially of Palestinians trying to grapple with things like, horrendous historical phenomena like the Holocaust, and the idea that, I hate to do this, but my own father, with his statement of the Palestinians are the victims of the victims, this grappling with the immensity of the Holocaust has been a good faith effort by a lot of Palestinians, especially in this country, and a lot of people engaged in pro-Palestinian advocacy. And it also completely elides the much more horrific and terrifying point that there is an entire right-wing ecosystem of anti-Semitism in this country that is far more violent, as the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting shows, and other actions, that has nothing to do with pro-Palestinian advocacy. And the leapfrogging of campus speech and campus pro-Palestinian advocacy over the far more dangerous phenomenon, it would be laughable and kind of mildly, or just laughable and confusing, if it weren't so dangerous.
Yeah, thank you so much for highlighting that. It is important to note. I mean, a lot of very powerful anti-Semites were at the pro-Israel event in Washington, D.C., including somebody who literally thought that Hitler was just trying to guide Jews to the homeland. So that's... On that note, professors, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with Project Censored and outline your latest article in Dissent. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we sign off?
No, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much for having us.
Really appreciate it.